A couple days ago, in a Zoom lesson with one of my private students, I had a student who was struggling to get through his lesson material, as we do, but was also complaining about the fact that he's always better when he's practicing, when he's not in his lesson, better when I'm at home. It made me realize that this is a conversation I have on almost a daily basis with my students. It's an experience that I've had being a student myself, and it's something that maybe we should talk about a little bit more. So we're going to talk about 10 reasons why you actually struggle, or the ways that you can overcome performance anxiety in your lessons and in your performing life. So most of these points are actually taken through the lens of private instruction or music instruction. But the reality is that this all works towards preparation for live performance as well. So the first 8 of these are pretty much about, preparing for lessons and how to practice. And then the last couple are actually more geared towards live performance. But the reality is that this is just one big thing. It's really about making sure that you understand how the process works for when you're learning to be a musician and how you're performing. Now, number 1 on our list here is just the fact that you're normal. You're everybody. I don't care who you are. You could be a brand new student who's never touched a guitar before. You could be me, who's taught lessons for years and has performed and has been a practicing musician for most of his life. The second that you start working on something new, or you're put in a situation where you're being judged about something, or you feel like you're being judged about something, you're going to get anxious about it, right? And this is actually going to cause problems that we're going to talk about in the next couple points. When I was in college, when I was 19, all music students generally have to pass a piano proficiency exam, which means that if you don't play piano before you get to college, you take lots of beginning piano classes, which I did. And in my first class, I would work on stuff really hard, and then I would go to do my recital in front of the class, or my test, and I would just blow it every time. And the teacher at that point basically said, you know what, before you put your hands on the instrument, like when you sit down at the piano, you need to remember to breathe. Because what was happening was I was sitting down and I was so anxious about what I was doing that I literally I'd run out of air, about 20 seconds into something and just blow it. Yeah, so sitting down before you play, take some breaths, get centered, kind of think about what the beginning of this music's going to sound like, hearing it in your head, making sure that you're feeling what the time is before you start playing the time. All these little things that we talk about in lessons, they're pretty important to remember when you're actually, playing your lesson material for your teacher, or if you're on stage and you're getting ready to play something. You don't want to just jump into things without your mind being prepared. So this is kind of the most universal of these things, is that everybody can have this same problem. And the way to solve this problem is, first of all, keep working really hard, keep preparing, but also, before you start playing, make sure that you're ready to play and make sure that you know what it is that you're playing. For me, I would get so anxious about what I was doing. I was really nervous about making music in front of other people, to the extent that I would just be really tense, and I would quit breathing, and I would lock down and get all shaky. And once I started realizing that I needed to take a moment before I started playing, things got a little bit easier. All right. So that's number 1, right? Don't forget to breathe, because we all breathe. Number 2 is the idea that good music instruction, or worthwhile time spent learning, is about playing challenging things that you can't do already, and internalizing them, or making them something that you can do without thinking. Right? If you're every week coming to your lesson and you're knocking it out of the park and it's easy, then you're not really being challenged. And maybe you and your teacher should talk about what it is that you're really doing there. In a minute, we're going to talk about the different ways that we think about music. And we're going to talk about something called the involuntary mind and something called the narrative mind. But at the core of it, it takes a while for challenging material to be internalized to the point where you're comfortable playing it, thus reducing your anxiety. Number 3, that's something I touched on a little bit earlier, is the fact that if you're mastering everything easily and you're not anxious about everything, you're not really being challenged. To me, true progress really comes from you working on things that you're not good at. When you're at home and you're practicing, If it sounds good all the time while you're practicing, you're not practicing, you're playing. If it sounds like you're struggling with something, that means you're actually working towards something new, right? You're breaking new ground, you're learning new skills, building new pathways, right? This is kind of an important thing to think about if you're really trying to become a better musician all around. If you're taking lessons because you want to learn songs and you just want someone to show you songs, that's what that is. But in reality, when we're actually trying to make you a better musician, we're always giving you something that is a challenge. And we're giving you something that, it's going to be hard. It's going to be frustrating. And you master that challenge, you move on to the next one. You do this for a couple months and you look back at the early challenges and you realize, oh, that wasn't that hard at all. I just didn't have it under my fingers. I've told students in the past that music instruction or learning how to be a musician, it's kind of like wanting to get to the next town over. All right. So you walk over to that next town thinking that's where you want to be. And then you look around and you go, oh, wait, that other town's got something else I like. Right. And it's kind of a never ending thing. As you get better, you start understanding what else you need to do, or you start experiencing new things. This is ever expanding sphere of things that you want to do versus things that you're not good at. And over time, things become easier. It's easier for me to learn now than it was when I was younger, mainly because I've spent so much time learning. Not because I'm really that much better of a musician, but because I have a better understanding of my process for learning. And what works for me may not necessarily work for my students. This is one of the things that as a teacher I have to be very aware of. It's the reality that everybody learns differently. So expectations, either your own or the teacher's, have to be constantly adjusted depending on where you're at and where your individual strengths and weaknesses are. So in number 4, we're going to talk about something that I've kind of stolen from some books that were written in the 1970s. And one of them was The Inner Game of Tennis. And there's a book based on it called The Inner Game of Music. There's probably an Inner Game of book for pretty much anything you can think of, I bet, at this point. But the guy who wrote Inner Game of Tennis was really good about training people how to become better tennis players. In the book, he speaks about the fact that your brain kind of works in 2 places. I'm going to use my names for this stuff because this is how I describe it to my students, and I don't really remember the book because I read it like 20 years ago. So essentially, we divide this up into 2 head spaces. We're going to call one side the involuntary mind and the other the narrative mind. And the involuntary mind, that's the place where when you're doing something you've done a million times, you can do it on autopilot. When you learned how to ride a bike, it was really difficult until you could do it. And then you didn't have to think about it anymore. You just get on a bike and ride. Or you learned how to throw a baseball. Or anything like that, right? Whether it's sports or any kind of habit, anything that you can do without thinking. The other side of that is what we are going to call the narrative mind. And that's the part of your mind or your headspace where you kind of think about these things. You're playing some piece of music. You're like, oh, here comes the hard part, right? Oh, this is going to suck. Oh, I just made a mistake there. They're all laughing at me. It's we have this place where, you're really more consciously thinking about what you're doing, right? Oh, here comes this part where I've got to move my first finger, right? Instead of just moving your first finger. If you think about this, anything new that you learn, you're kind of in that narrative mind space. You're still thinking about like, oh, okay, here on the chord chart, it shows my fingers here. I got to put my fingers here. You're not at the point where you just play C major, G major, D major. When I think of those chords, it's one movement, and I don't think about what individual fingers do. When my students are learning them for the first time, and as did I, my first finger's got to go on the 2nd fret, I've got to do this thing, and then I've got to strum with this hand. All of these things, all of these tasks for me have basically become one thing that happens involuntarily. So when I'm on a gig, I can sing and play guitar, right? The guitar just keeps going. It's not that big of a deal. That was really hard for me to get, but you've got to spend a lot of time in repetition, making something move from that narrative headspace where you're consciously thinking about it to where it's more involuntary, and then you can kind of think more in terms of abstractions. One thing to consider is that it takes a while for any learned behavior to become a habit. I had read years ago that it takes 21 days of daily repetition for something to become a habit. Before I started recording this video, I actually took a quick look on Google. I just Googled how long for a learned behavior to become a habit. And I'll put this on the screen. But even just the Google responses, like Google says 66 days, and then it could take anywhere from 18 to 254 days, strangely specific, for a person to form a new habit, and an average of 66 days for a new behavior to become automatic. The most common number that I see is 21 days, right? So it takes weeks, essentially, for you to move something from that narrative headspace, that narrative mind, into the involuntary space, where it's just as normal as walking and breathing and riding a bike. So when you learn something one week and you come to your lesson the next week and it's hard to play, well, of course it's hard to play. You haven't had the amount of time. It's not even about you. It's just about the passage of time. You haven't had the ability to learn something well enough that it becomes automatic and easy for you. The other thing is that it also shows you, regular daily practice is kind of important. I tell my students, I don't care, if you spend 3 hours on one day practicing if the rest of the week you're not picking up the instrument. I would rather a student pick up their guitar for 5-10 minutes a day, every day, than to spend hours and hours one day the day before the lesson, because you need that regular repetition. It's this, becoming a habit sort of thing that we're working towards. And even just a little bit of physical contact with the instrument while your brain is thinking about this stuff and processing it, that will give you forward movement better than waiting for an hour in your schedule to happen every day. And I get a lot of adults that do that. Well, I didn't have an hour to practice today, so I just put it off, and then I caught up. Well, you never catch up. It's like sleep. Really, you're always at a deficit if you think that way. To me, it's better, put a guitar in your office if you work in an office, or leave it out on a guitar stand, or sit on the couch and noodle with it. All of those things, I think they contribute towards you internalizing this stuff better than if you just sat down and focused for 3 hours on Sunday before your Monday lesson. Number 5 is basically what we were just talking about. If you're moving this material from one space to the other, from your narrative mind to your involuntary mind, or you're internalizing it, it takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes a certain amount of personal forgiveness. You've got to give yourself the time and the opportunity and have a little grace with yourself, right? Because the reality is that we all want to do something as soon as we know we're supposed to do it. And on guitar, we just want to learn something and be able to drop it in. I used to be horrible about learning some new licks and then going to a gig and trying to drop them into songs and then just screwing up the songs, right? I did not give myself the time and the space to actually get that stuff internalized and processed and synthesized into what it is that I do. I've got a big enough vocabulary at this point that I can hear something, and if it's within my already internalized database of musical ideas, I can do that to a certain extent. But if something is brand spanking new, I have to give it the time. I have to give it the effort. And that's that thing that you really want to consider, is the fact that this is not something that happens quickly. It's not something, if you don't enjoy the process and you don't enjoy the journey, you're not really going to get very far with the guitar. If you're into just playing songs and you're happy with kind of playing stuff by rote, that's one thing. And, if that makes you happy, that's cool, because, this is essentially a luxury pastime for most people. Some of us are fortunate enough for it to be a living, but in reality, for most of us, or at least most of you guys watching this video, this is something that you're doing to have fun with, and I get that, or, you're getting value out of it in your life, but you want to keep in mind that it's something that you should enjoy picking the guitar up and playing with it. It should be something that you don't mind spending some time with and kind of fighting some battles with. There is a saying, practice makes perfect. And it's one of the most incorrect statements I think ever uttered, ever. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. If you're repeating something, it's getting internalized eventually. If you're repeating something improperly, you're internalizing the wrong thing. You need to make sure that what you do is actually accurate. You're paying attention to the basics, right? Make sure you know what something is as well as you can before you start working to internalize it. Some of this is just being, a competent music student, or a competent student, not even a music student. When you're learning how to play music, you should understand how to count rhythms in time. You should know where your notes are on the fretboard. eventually learn the layout of the fretboard. All of these basic things that will help you understand if you're being accurate or not. The biggest thing is rhythm and time. That is always the biggest deficit I see in my students that are adults who have played for any length of time. And it's one of the bigger challenges for brand new students who are just getting started. But if you don't understand how time flows, how it's subdivided, and how it works relative to playing guitar, because there's a whole different thing there, and we've got videos and videos and videos on that, it makes it really difficult to play anything accurately. So then you spend weeks and weeks and weeks working on something and repeating it, and it's still not right. And what it is the fact that you didn't necessarily define what it is you're supposed to be doing before you started repeating it and making it permanent. If you practice something incorrectly, that's part of what's going to happen in a lesson. If we get back to the idea of the lesson, you can work on something all week. If you worked on it incorrectly and you get into the lesson, the teacher says, well, it actually needs to be this other thing. You're missing this one element. Don't expect it to be fixed in the lesson for the most part. All right? You're going to have to go back and relearn these things. Frustrating, but it's reality. Number 7 is something actually, it's a saying that I read in some awful science fiction book I was reading, because I like reading that stuff for fun. It had absolutely nothing to do with music, but it has everything to do with process. And I really like this idea that slow makes smooth and smooth makes quick. The idea being that you have to work on something slow enough that you know it well enough that you can do it smoothly. You're not stopping to think. Your narrative mind is not giving your fingers individual instructions for every movement. You're just getting there from one place to the other. You can only do that slowly. You can't play any new music or any new idea up to the tempo of the music and expect it to be accurate, especially if you're just getting started on guitar. You have to remember that on the guitar, you have two hands doing completely different motions for completely different reasons. Right? Your fretting hand has one set of skills it has to master. Your picking or your finger picking or flat picking hand has its own set of skills. Right? It gets complex pretty quickly. Right? So in order to articulate all of this stuff together, I think it's really important that you do things as slow as you can, doing it with a metronome, making sure that you're keeping everything nice and consistent time-wise while you're working this stuff out. Once you get something accurate, where you can do it multiple times in a row without making a mistake. I had a classical guitar teacher when I was younger who basically said, you don't know anything until you can play it 3 times in a row perfectly. And while that's not 100% something I agree with, it is kind of a practice rule I do use. I try and get to that ideal. And if you get to that point, then that slow and smooth thing has worked out for you. And once you've got it like that and everything is accurate, it's very easy to speed things up to tempo, right? Because you've got everything programmed or built into how you're going to play music. If you don't have that stuff there and you start playing right at the speed that the song is going to be at, you're not going to catch the problems or the things that you've got wrong. And you're just going back to this whole idea that practice and repetition makes permanent. It's much harder to go back and fix or relearn something. Number 8 is a really common problem with the adults that I teach. And it used to not be a big issue with my younger students, but it kind of has, especially with the pandemic, which is that, you may be going to lessons, you may be practicing a lot, but you're not actually playing any music. You're not performing or having any performance type activity. Now that could be just hanging out, jamming with your friends in the garage. It could be playing gigs. It could be even just recording things for Instagram and doing things at a level where you want people to be able to hear it. In music school, you've got performance tests, you've got recitals, you've got juries, which are basically recitals for your faculty where they grade you, which juries are always the most nerve-wracking because it's literally 3 music teachers with the music in front of them holding your grade in their hand. But the process of preparing music to be able to play it's a whole thing. All right, it encompasses all of the stuff we've talked about, and then being able to execute it in front of other people. That's really important, even if it is just jamming, playing some blues in the garage, or someone's playing a D minor chord and you're jamming your Dorian scales, or whatever it is that you do. The actual act of making music, either with other people or in front of other people is another part of the development of you as a musician. I think it's really important to play, even if it's just, getting it together and playing for the people in your household, or, like I said, jamming with your friends. To me, taking music lessons is about making music. And I think for most people, once they're able to deal with the anxiety of public performance, if they've never really done much of it, and public performance means literally playing for anybody else in the room. I mean, it could be for your cats for all I care, but like realistically being able to take something and execute it well in front of another person, that is a whole nother level of competency. All right. And it really, the process of getting there really helps you become a better musician. So for number 9, everything is like I said, it's been through the lens of private instruction and music lessons. But the reality is even on stage, all of these things apply. If you're struggling to play gigs or to perform well on stage, you kind of have to look at how you're preparing things first. Do you really work the music through in a way, like my teacher's rule about, can you play something accurately, 3 times in a row without making a mistake? Do you have to think about stuff? Do you have to read notes on stage? I've got students where they've got big binders full of notes, and we do like recitals and performances, and they're literally like just got their head buried in their notes, and they're not really making music. They're following instructions even on stage, and it never sounds very good. Having the occasional like cheat sheet or something like that is okay, but if that's the only way you can get through a live performance, it's not so great. People with the advent of the smartphone, seeing people doing this on stage where they're literally reading lyrics off of their phone is one of my biggest pet peeves, because you don't know anything well enough to perform it. You're just reciting it at that point. Same thing with jazz musicians where they've got either their phone or their iPad and they're only reading the charts off the book. They don't have any of that music internalized. We all have gigs where we read music. That's one thing. That's one skill set. But that's not the only way to play music. And depending on the kind of music you're playing, we really don't want to see a rock band where everybody's reading lyrics and everybody's got their devices out and everyone's, rock music should be about energy. Blues music. A lot of these styles of music that we play on guitar, to me, they're very diminished by people like following notes or following charts on stage, because they're about energy. And this is just someone, I read music, I teach music reading at the conservatory, I play gigs where I have to read music. It's an important skill. Sometimes it's the only way to make certain gigs work, like if you're doing something with a bunch of musicians you've never met before. It's important, and you want to try and make that sound as good as possible. But at the music student level, get used to internalizing the music. Make sure that it's prepared and that you know it and that you can perform it without any kind of additional reminders or notes. Number 10, the last one on here, it's a little bit more about self-care. I used to be bad about even just making sure I was properly hydrated before being on stage or being well rested. When you're a young musician, you don't think about these things. You go, you party, you have fun, you do whatever you're going to do, and then you just show up and throw your amp on stage and play. And, sometimes to mediocre results. And as I've gotten older, it's become a bigger deal. Before I go play on stage, I need to do certain things. I need to make sure I've eaten properly. I need to make sure that my hands are warmed up. I need to make sure that I'm properly hydrated. I've got a routine. Every musician has a different routine. But if I'm just thrown out there, like there's been some sort of thing that's happened where I literally have to rush to a gig and pick up an instrument cold, I'm not going to play as well. Definitely not going to sing as well. So the first part of it is just make sure that you're taking care of yourself into the period of time before the gig, all right, that you're warmed up, you've thought about the music, you know that you don't have any other issues. I typically get everywhere way too early because since I play guitar, there's always some there's something that I might be broken or some problem you have to work around or some problem with the venue or the PA. There's always something that if I show up early and I'm ready for, it never happens. But if I show up at the last minute, you get stuck dealing with it, and then my headspace is completely blown because I'm worried about, like, making sure the PA works as opposed to playing music right off the bat, right? So, giving myself the time to get places, making sure that I'm well fed, well hydrated, making sure that I know the music I'm supposed to play, or I've got all of my materials for the gig. All of these things are important because for me, without it, I get kind of anxious. I will have performance anxiety if I don't feel comfortable knowing everything that I'm supposed to know and being in a good physical place. And honestly, this is probably the hardest part for me. I'm an adult. I've got a family, kids, and a house, and you've got all of the adult responsibilities, and then you go to the venue, and you also need to make sure that you're able to forget about all of that stuff and perform for people, because they don't know that you had something for lunch that didn't agree with you, or that you're upset about something that happened, or you had car problems on the way. They don't care. Their judgment and their enjoyment of the night is based on what they're hearing at that moment in time. So you want to give yourself the best possible start to the night so that you're giving them a good moment in time. So this video, it's really one of those things where I'm kind of talking through some stuff. These are conversations I have with my students on a regular basis. You may have different ways of looking at these things. And if you do, put them in the comments below. Let me know what you think about what I've talked about, but also what may work for you in terms of working on music preparation, pre-gig preparation, just dealing with anxiety in general when you're making music. It's a great conversation to have, and I'm always learning new approaches and new things. So if you did like this video, please hit the notification bell and subscribe and the thumbs up and all that stuff. That helps us make more videos. In addition to all of this stuff here on YouTube, I'm also available for private instruction. That's one of the things I do. Doesn't matter where you are. I've been teaching via Skype or Zoom or other video platforms since 2007. So I've been doing the remote teaching thing for a very long time. I've got all of my materials digitized. Moving online for the pandemic wasn't a big transition for me, but I've been doing it long enough that I'm very comfortable teaching. So if you're interested in private lessons, please let me know. Hit me in the DMs or in the comments below and I'll get a hold of you.